Chapter 1. The Singular Visitor of Baker Street. It has always been my contention that the true measure of a man's character is not revealed in the grand triumphs of his public life, but rather in the quiet, undisturbed hours of a London November, when the fog rolls in from the Thames like a grey woolen blanket, smothering the gas lamps and driving honest folk to their hearths. Such was the evening of our encounter with Lord Arthur St. John, an evening so thick with moisture that the condensation ran in rivulets down the window panes of 221B Baker Street, blurring the silhouette of the hansom cabs crawling through the street below. My friend Sherlock Holmes had been stretched out upon the Persian sofa for the better part of 3 hours, his lean hawk-like profile cast in sharp relief by the flickering amber glow of the coal fire. He had scarcely spoken a word since the tea tray had been cleared away. Instead, his long nervous fingers were steepled together, tapping gently against one another in a rhythmic cadence, while his dark, piercing eyes stared unblinkingly at the ceiling. I sat opposite him in the worn leather armchair, halfway through a stout medical journal on the recent outbreaks of scarlatina in the East End, though my mind was more than half occupied by the stillness of the room. It was an ominous stillness, the kind that invariably preceded one of those extraordinary intellectual exercises which Holmes pursued with the relentless hunger of a bloodhound. You find the article on page 48 particularly tedious, do you not, Watson? Holmes' voice broke the silence with startling clarity. He had not shifted his position by so much as a fraction of an inch, yet his auditory faculties were as razor-sharp as ever. I lowered the journal, blinking slightly. Tedious? Not at all, Holmes. The statistics on pediatric immunity are quite illuminating. Holmes gave a low, dry chuckle, a sound devoid of genuine mirth. Immunity to medical jargon, perhaps. But your eyes have wandered to the corner of the mantelpiece 3 times in the last 10 minutes, and your thumb has traced the edge of the page in a circle, a sure sign of abstract preoccupation. Moreover, your pipe has been unlit for 20 minutes, yet you reach for your pouch every time the wind rattles the loose shingle on the roof. You are meditating on whether Mrs. Hudson's mutton will be tough tonight. Nothing so mundane, I replied, shaking my head with a half-smile. I was wondering, as I often do during these dreary winter weeks, when Scotland Yard might stumble upon a problem complex enough to rouse you from your armchairs. Lestrade was by this morning. He looked singularly distressed. Holmes swung his legs off the sofa with a sudden lithe motion that bespoke his coiled physical energy. He reached for his violin, the battered Stradivarius that had shared our triumphs and our eccentricities, and tucked it beneath his chin. Lestrade's distress is a constant fixture of the Metropolitan Constabulary, my dear fellow, Holmes remarked, drawing the bow lightly across the strings to produce a plaintive, melancholic wail that seemed to mimic the gale outside. His mind is like a badly catalogued archive, cluttered with superficial details, lacking index, and entirely devoid of imagination. He sees a footprint in the mud and immediately concludes a boot made it. He fails to ask whose boot, why it was worn, what manner of soil clings to the heel, or whether the wearer walked with a shortened stride due to a neglected hip injury contracted during the Crimean campaign. And yet, I observed, he relies upon you with an almost touching regularity. Necessity, Watson, pure necessity. Holmes laid the violin aside just as a sharp, imperative ring echoed from the doorbell below. We both paused. The clock on the sideboard ticked off the seconds in the heavy silence. It was nearing 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, an ungodly hour for casual visitors, particularly given the miserable state of the weather. We heard the heavy tread of Mrs. Hudson's slippers ascending the stairs, followed by the sound of her polite, flustered voice in the hallway. A moment later, the door swung open, and our landlady announced our visitor with a mixture of awe and nervous agitation. "Lord Arthur St. John, gentlemen," she whispered, stepping aside. The man who entered our modest sitting-room was one whose name and visage were rarely absent from the society columns of the Morning Post. Lord Arthur St. John, second son of the late Earl of Melbourne, was a gentleman of impeccable tailoring, though his appearance tonight bore the unmistakable hallmarks of severe strain. His overcoat, fashioned from the finest Donegal tweed, was soaked through at the shoulders, and his beaver skin hat was clutched in white-knuckled hands that trembled slightly despite his obvious efforts to maintain an aristocratic composure. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, with high, aristocratic cheekbones, a sharp nose, and a thin moustache that was meticulously waxed at the ends. Yet his eyes, pale, watery blue, darted nervously about our cluttered room, taking in the chemical retorts on the side table, the unwashed glassware, and finally resting upon Holmes with an expression of desperate appeal. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" the visitor inquired, his voice strained and thin, carrying the crisp, clipped intonation of the Eton-bred elite. Holmes rose gracefully from the hearth, his tall, spare figure dominating the room. He stepped forward, his eyes instantly locking onto Lord Arthur's with that unsettling, microscopic intensity that had made criminals quail and statesmen stammer. "At your service, Lord Arthur," Holmes said smoothly. "I observe that you arrived in a hired brougham rather than your own carriage, that you have walked the final 20 yards through the slush without an umbrella despite the downpour, and that you are laboring under a mental burden so acute that you have buttoned your waistcoat through the wrong eyelet. Pray, draw up to the fire. Mrs. Hudson will bring another cup of tea in a moment. Watson, be good enough to hand our guest the brandy decanter. His circulation requires immediate assistance." Lord Arthur stared at Holmes, his jaw slackening in undisguised astonishment. He collapsed into the leather armchair I had just vacated, his chest heaving as if he had run a mile rather than climbed a flight of stairs. "Good God," the nobleman whispered, clutching the glass of brandy I poured for him with fingers that rattled the crystal against the rim. "They told me in the clubs that your reputation for observation bordered on the supernatural, Mr. Holmes, but to witness it firsthand, it is uncanny." "There is nothing supernatural about it, my dear lord," Holmes said lightly, resuming his seat and crossing his long legs. "Observation is simply a matter of training the eye to register what the mind is ordinarily too lazy to process. Your right trouser cuff is caked with yellow clay peculiar to the carriage stands off Regent Street, while your left is relatively clean, indicating you stepped down hastily on the left side of a public vehicle. Your carriage badge is missing from the lapel where you usually pin your club insignia, suggesting you wish to travel incognito. As for the waistcoat," Holmes pointed a slender finger with a dry smile. "The third button is displaced by half an inch, an error no gentleman of your station would commit unless his thoughts were elsewhere. Now, let us dispense with preliminaries. You did not brave a November gale at 8 o'clock in the evening merely to test my powers of deduction. What has occurred at Malvern House?" Lord Arthur set the brandy glass down untouched, his face draining of what little colour it possessed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and lowered his voice to a hoarse whisper. "My brother, Lord Julian St. John, is dead, Mr. Holmes," he said, "and the police believe he took his own life." Holmes' eyebrows rose slightly, the only outward sign of the sudden surge of professional interest that I knew was rippling through his analytical mind. "Indeed?" Holmes murmured softly. "And your own presence here tonight suggests that you hold a different view of the matter. Tell us everything, Lord Arthur, from the beginning, and pray, do not omit the small details. They are invariably the ones that matter most." Chapter 2. The scene at Malvern House. The silence that followed Lord Arthur's announcement hung heavily in the room, broken only by the steady hiss of the coal fire and the relentless drumming of rain against the window panes. Holmes leaned forward, his elbows resting upon his knees, his steepled fingers tapping gently beneath his chin. His eyes, bright and calculating, studied our visitor with the keen detachment of a surgeon examining an interesting specimen. "Suicide," Holmes murmured, the word tasting like something bitter upon his tongue. "A convenient conclusion for Scotland Yard, no doubt. It requires no exertion of the grey matter, no tracking of foreign elements, and no awkward diplomatic inquiries. Tell me, Lord Arthur, upon what evidence did Inspector Lestrade or his subordinates arrive at this remarkably swift verdict?" Lord Arthur drew a handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his brow, though his skin was ice cold. "It was found in the study at Malvern House early this morning, Mr. Holmes. Julian was discovered slumped over his mahogany desk. A service revolver, an old Webley belonging to our late father, lay upon the Persian rug beside his right hand. The door was bolted from the inside. The heavy velvet drapes were drawn against the morning light. and there was a single bullet wound through his temple. Dr. Thorsby, our family physician, was summoned immediately, and he declared it an unmistakable act of self-destruction. The police concurred within the hour. I listened with a growing sense of professional unease. To a medical mind, the physical parameters described, a locked room, a firearm within reach, and a mortal head wound, presented a formidable argument for suicide. Yet, as I glanced toward my companion, I saw no agreement upon Holmes' sharp features. Instead, a faint, sardonic smile played at the corners of his mouth. "A locked room," Holmes repeated, his voice dropping into a register of quiet amusement. That perennial favorite of the unimaginative detective. It never ceases to amaze me how easily the human intellect is overawed by a turned key and a dead bolt. Pray, Lord Arthur, walk us through the discovery, who found the body, and what precise state was the room in when the door was forced. "It was Wilkins, the head butler," Lord Arthur replied, his voice trembling slightly as he clutched the edge of the armrests. Julian had been working late in his study, a habit he had fallen into over the past several months, managing our estate accounts and private correspondence. When he failed to appear for breakfast by 9 o'clock, Wilkins knocked. Receiving no reply, and noting that the key was turned within the lock, the old man became alarmed. He fetched the spare key from the baize door downstairs, unlocked the heavy oak portal, and found my brother. "And the key in the spare set," Holmes interjected sharply. "Was it in the lock on the outside when Wilkins arrived?" "Yes," Lord Arthur nodded, looking somewhat surprised by the question. "It was hanging vertically in the keyhole, just as Julian had left it the night before, or so Wilkins assumed. Or so anyone wishing to simulate a locked room mystery might have arranged it," Holmes corrected smoothly. "A simple piece of twine, a loop of wire, or the ingenious application of a pair of long-nosed pliers beneath the crack of the door can accomplish the trick of turning a key from the outside with astonishing ease. Houdini and his brethren have no monopoly on such elementary mechanics." "Did Wilkins notice anything else? The position of the furniture, the state of the desktop, or perhaps a lingering scent in the air?" Lord Arthur frowned, struggling to recall the panicked moments of that morning. "Wilkins was half out of his wits with shock, Mr. Holmes. He spoke of papers strewn about the desk and an overturned inkwell, but the police quickly gathered those up. They were chiefly concerned with a small leather-bound notebook that lay open near my brother's hand, a ledger with a plain black cover. At the mention of the ledger, Holmes' posture stiffened perceptibly. A sudden light flared in his dark eyes. "Ah," Holmes said softly, leaning back into the cushions, "the ledger. And what, pray tell, was contained within this black book that commanded such immediate attention from the constabulary?" "That is precisely why I am here, Mr. Holmes," Lord Arthur said, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper as he leaned forward once more, casting a nervous glance toward the door, as if fearing eavesdroppers even in our secluded Baker Street quarters. "The police maintain it was simply a private journal detailing my brother's financial embarrassments, debts accumulated at the card tables, investments gone sour, and loans secured from questionable moneylenders in the city. They claim it was the shame of impending ruin that drove him to pull the trigger." "And you do not believe your brother was financially ruined?" I asked, interjecting for the first time. "Julian was cautious to a fault," Lord Arthur insisted, shaking his head vehemently. "He inherited a steady hand for estate management from our father. While our family fortunes are not what they were a generation ago, there was no threat of insolvency, certainly not enough to drive a man of Julian's temperament to take his own life. More importantly, Mr. Holmes, I managed to catch a glimpse of the pages before Lestrade locked the ledger away in his coat pocket." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what did you see, Lord Arthur?" "It was not a record of debts," the nobleman said, his breath hitching slightly. "It was a catalogue of names, dates, and cipher codes. Some of the names belonged to prominent members of Parliament and the Foreign Office, and beside each entry there was a sum of money recorded, not as a debt owed, but as a payment received. Julian was not keeping an account of his losses. He was keeping a record of blackmail." The silence in our sitting room grew profound. The wind outside seemed to howl with renewed fury, rattling the window panes as if demanding admittance to our conference. Holmes rose slowly from his chair, walking over to the mantelpiece where he picked up his unlit pipe. Though he did not apply a match to it, he turned to face our visitor, his expression now entirely devoid of levity. Blackmail, Holmes repeated, the word falling like a lead weight. A delicate trade, and one that invariably leads to a violent end. Did Inspector Lestrade exhibit any curiosity regarding these names and cipher codes? None, Lord Arthur replied bitterly. Lestrade was utterly dismissive. He saw only the word debts scrawled on the flyleaf in my brother's hand, though I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, that particular inscription did not look like Julian's natural handwriting, and he promptly closed his notebook, declaring the case open and shut. He told me that unearthing political scandals would only bring public disgrace upon our family name, and that we should accept the coroner's verdict with gratitude. How very considerate of Scotland Yard, Holmes remarked, with a dry, ironic curl of his lip. They display a sudden, touching tenderness for the aristocracy whenever an investigation threatens to ruffle the feathers of Whitehall. It is a sure sign, Watson, that we are treading upon dangerous ground. When the police become suddenly anxious to sweep a corpse under the carpet in the name of discretion, you may be entirely certain that someone in high authority stands to lose far more than a reputation if the truth is brought to light. I watched Holmes as he paced slowly toward the window, peering out into the swirling fog of Baker Street. The transformation in my friend was complete. The indolent dreamer of an hour ago had vanished, replaced by the relentless hunter of truth. Every muscle in his frame was tuned to concert pitch. Lord Arthur, Holmes said without turning around, his voice low and commanding. You have come to the right place, though you have delayed by nearly 12 hours. The trail is still warm, but the scent will begin to fade by dawn if we do not act. Watson and I will accompany you to Malvern House tonight. Lord Arthur sprang from his seat, a look of profound relief washing over his strained features. Tonight, Mr. Holmes, in this weather? The police have sealed the study. Lestrade has the key. Holmes turned back, a sharp, confident smile cutting through the shadows of the room. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew his silver pocket watch, flipping the cover open with a crisp click. Lestrade has a key, true, Holmes said, his eyes glinting with a mischievous brilliance. But Inspector Lestrade has never matched wits with the locksmiths of Tottenham Court Road, nor does he possess a duplicate set of picklocks that can bypass an ordinary Chubb mortise in under 40 seconds. Grab your overcoat, Watson. We are going to pay a nocturnal visit to Malvern House, and we shall see for ourselves what secrets are hidden within the Black Ledger. Chapter 3. The Shadows of Malvern House. The journey from Baker Street to Belgravia was accomplished within a hansom cab whose driver was induced to make extraordinary speed through the slick, labyrinthine streets by the promise of an extravagant sovereign. The fog had thickened into a dense yellow pall that choked the lungs and swallowed the flickering gas standards whole, reducing the great metropolis to a phantom world of looming brick facades and muffled carriage wheels. Throughout the ride, Holmes remained utterly silent, huddled deep within the folds of his Inverness cape, his chin buried in his woolen scarf. He did not speak a single word, yet I knew his mind was racing through the architectural layout of Malvern House, the mechanical permutations of a locked door, and the psychological profile of a man who dealt in the currency of political ruin. Lord Arthur sat opposite us, shivering slightly, his gloved hands gripping the head of his walking stick, as if it were a shield against the coming revelations. When the cab finally drew to a halt, it did so with a muffled scrape upon the damp gravel of a secluded carriage drive. We had arrived at Malvern House, a sprawling, imposing Victorian mansion set back from the thoroughfare behind high wrought-iron gates and a perimeter wall choked with ivy. The main body of the house was dark, save for a faint, sickly glimmer of light filtering through the upper-story windows where the servants' quarters lay, and a solitary lamp burning low in the ground-floor portico. The police watch has been withdrawn for the night, Lord Arthur whispered, stepping down carefully from the cab and gesturing toward the gloomy entrance. Lestrade stationed a constable at the gates earlier, but he was recalled to Scotland Yard around midnight. Lestrade assured me the study was sealed with official wax upon the door handle. Holmes stepped down lightly into the gravel, his keen eyes sweeping across the dark, forbidding facade of the mansion before resting upon the front steps. He reached into his pocket and extracted a small leather case containing his delicate set of steel picks. "Official wax," Holmes muttered with a faint, derisive snort. "A wonderful deterrent for a burglar of timid disposition, but scarcely an obstacle for anyone possessing a modicum of patience and a penknife." "Lead the way quietly, Lord Arthur. We have no desire to rouse Wilkins or the rest of your household staff just yet." We moved in single file along the wet flagstone path, keeping close to the dripping boxwood hedges. The chill of the November air seemed to seep directly into one's bones, carrying with it the damp smell of decaying autumn leaves and coal smoke. Lord Arthur produced a heavy brass key for a side service entrance that bypassed the front hall entirely, unlocking it with a soft metallic click that sounded unnaturally loud in the dead of night. We stepped through into the subterranean nether regions of Malvern House, a vast, stone-flagged corridor that smelled faintly of polish, roast mutton and damp earth. Every footstep we took was swallowed by the thick Persian runners that lined the grand staircases leading up to the ground-floor gallery. The atmosphere within the mansion was heavy, oppressive, and laden with that peculiar stillness that belongs exclusively to houses harboring sudden, violent death. Holmes walked with the silent, gliding stride of a cat, his hand brushing lightly against the polished mahogany banister. As we reached the ground-floor landing, the faint amber glow from the street lamps outside caught the edge of a heavy double door at the end of the corridor, the study of Lord Julian St. John. Sure enough, a strip of red sealing wax bearing the official insignia of the Metropolitan Police was stretched tightly across the gap between the double doors, anchored to the wooden frame by a dab of crimson adhesive. "There," Lord Arthur breathed, stopping a few paces short and pointing a trembling finger. "That is the seal Lestrade applied." Holmes stepped forward without hesitation. He ignored the wax entirely. Instead, he pulled a small, highly polished magnifying lens from his pocket, snapping it open with a flick of his thumb, and bent double to examine the keyhole of the right-hand door. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, gesturing for me to approach closer. "Notice the minute flecks of metallic dust clinging to the brass rim of the keyhole. Not iron filings, nor wood splinters, but brass shavings rubbed away from the interior mechanism. This door has been unlocked and relocked from the outside within the past 24 hours, using a skeleton key of inferior grade. Lestrade, in all his infinite wisdom, saw only the wax seal and assumed the room had remained untouched since the coroner's visit." I peered through the gloom, marveling at how my friend's eyes could extract such vital testimony from a few microscopic grains of metal. "Then the room was entered after the police departed, or before they even arrived," Holmes corrected softly. "Someone possessed a duplicate key to this study long before Inspector Lestrade ever set foot upon these carpets. Let us see if our friend's private sanctuary is equally accommodating." Holmes produced a slender, L-shaped piece of tempered steel from his pocket and inserted it into the keyhole with feather-light precision. There was a faint, metallic whisper within the lock, a delicate click, followed a second later by a distinct, satisfying thud as the internal bolt slid back. Lord Arthur let out a sharp gasp of astonishment, but Holmes merely smiled, pocketed his pick, and pressed gently against the heavy mahogany panels. The door swung open silently on well-oiled hinges, admitting us into the dark, scent-laden confines of the late Lord Julian's study. It was a magnificent room, designed to reflect the scholarly and political ambitions of its former occupant. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 of the walls, packed with leather-bound volumes of parliamentary debates, legal treatises, and classic literature. A massive mahogany writing desk dominated the center of the room, positioned so that the occupant could gaze out over the gardens through tall, shuttered French windows. Heavy crimson velvet drapes covered those windows, shutting out the outside world completely. Upon the Persian rug near the center of the desk lay a dark, irregular stain, dried to a deep, ominous rust brown, marking the spot where Julian St. John's life had been so violently extinguished. Holmes stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind us. He did not rush toward the bloodstain, nor did he examine the empty chair where the victim had sat. Instead, he dropped immediately to his hands and knees, crawling methodically across the carpet with his magnifying lens hovering mere inches above the wool fibers, scanning for clues that had eluded both the family physician and the Metropolitan Constabulary. "Holmes," I whispered, feeling an involuntary shudder run down my spine as I looked around the shadowed room. "Is it wise to disturb the scene before Lestrade returns in the morning?" "Lestrade will return to find an empty cage, my dear Watson, or a very different set of facts than the ones he so comfortably settled upon," Holmes replied. his voice muffled as he peered beneath the heavy mahogany pedestal of the desk. "Look here. Do you see what our friends at Scotland Yard so brilliantly overlooked?" I knelt beside him, bringing my own eyes down to the level of the floorboards. Just beneath the overhang of the lower desk drawer lay a small crumpled piece of white paper, half hidden in the shadow of a brass wastebasket. Holmes reached out with 2 fingers, lifting the paper carefully by its corner so as not to disturb any latent friction or dust marks. He carried it over to the small desk lamp, which he clicked on with a quiet snap, illuminating the parchment beneath the green glass shade. It was not a suicide note, it was a fragment of a railway timetable, torn hastily down the center, bearing the schedule for the evening express from Victoria Station to the Kentish coast, specifically Dover. Across the margin, written in a hurried, nervous hand that contrasted sharply with the neat script of the ledger, were 3 words: "Midnight, the cliffs, do not fail." "A rendezvous," I breathed, looking up at Holmes with sudden clarity. Julian was not writing a suicide note when he died. He was receiving a summons. "A summons, indeed," Holmes agreed, his eyes gleaming with intellectual triumph as he turned the paper over to examine the reverse side. And noticed the smudge of grease and coal dust near the corner, the unmistakable signature of a steam packet or a railway engine waiting at the terminus. "But that is not all, Watson. Look at the desk itself. Examine the central inkwell." I stood up and approached the massive mahogany desktop. The police had cleared away most of the clutter, but the heavy bronze inkstand remained fixed in its recessed groove. "What of it?" I asked, leaning in. "It appears to be a standard double inkwell of Victorian manufacture." "Precisely," Holmes said quietly, pointing a slender finger at the 2 glass wells set into the bronze base. "One side contains black ink, which was used to draft the ledger entries. The other side, the red inkwell, is bone dry. Yet look at the rim of the left well. There is a distinct smear of fresh, wet red ink upon the polished brass, as though a pen had been dipped hastily within the past 24 hours. Yet Lord Arthur has assured us that Julian used only black ink for his estate accounts." Lord Arthur stepped forward, his face pale as he stared at the desk. "Julian never used red ink for anything, Mr. Holmes. Our father kept a red ledger for estate expenditures, but Julian discarded the practice years ago." "Then someone else sat at this desk after Julian's death," Holmes declared, his voice dropping into a steely, resolute tone. "Someone who required red ink for a very specific purpose, perhaps to alter an entry or to sign a document that required an official correction, and more importantly." Holmes reached down and slid open the top left drawer of the desk, which had been forced open by the police and left slightly ajar. He rummaged through the remaining loose stationery before pausing, his fingers closing around something small and metallic. He withdrew it slowly, holding it up beneath the green lamp glow. It was a small silver cufflink, shaped like a heraldic lion clutching a broken sword, an exquisite piece of jewelry, forged from heavy sterling silver and bearing an intricate monogram engraved upon the reverse. "Whose monogram is that, Lord Arthur?" Holmes asked softly, extending his hand. Lord Arthur stepped closer, peered at the silver trinket in the dim light, and let out a sharp gasp that sounded remarkably like a stifled cry of horror. "Good God," the nobleman whispered, backing away a step as if the harmless piece of metal were a venomous snake. "That belongs to Sir Reginald Vance, the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs." Chapter 4. The Under-Secretary's Dilemma. The mention of Sir Reginald Vance's name seemed to suck the remaining warmth out of the already freezing study. The silver cufflink lay upon the palm of Holmes's hand like a piece of burning coal, its intricate heraldic lion catching the emerald glow of the desk lamp and casting long, distorted shadows across the mahogany surface. Lord Arthur backed away until his shoulders struck the heavy bookshelves, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The shock of the revelation had completely stripped away his aristocratic composure, leaving behind the raw, naked terror of a man standing on the edge of an abyss. "Sir Reginald Vance," Lord Arthur repeated, the name tasting foul upon his tongue. "Are you entirely certain, Mr. Holmes? That cufflink, it is a distinct pattern. Only a handful were cast for the Privy Council dining club. Reginald has worn them for years." Holmes did not answer immediately. He slipped the silver trinket into a small paper envelope he extracted from his pocket. sealing the flap with a crisp crease before sliding it securely into his inner coat pocket. His movements were calculated, steady, and utterly devoid of the nervous haste that gripped our nobleman client. "There is no mistaking a crest of that magnitude, Lord Arthur," Holmes replied smoothly, walking over to the window and idly running a finger along the edge of the heavy velvet drapery. "Heraldry is a science unto itself, quite as precise as anatomy or organic chemistry. The heraldic lion rampant, clutching a broken broadsword with a three-pointed label in chief, that is the ancient coat of arms of the Vance lineage, dating back to the reign of Edward III. Sir Reginald may be a pillar of the Foreign Office, a trusted advisor to the Prime Minister, and a regular guest at royal banquets, but he is also, it would appear, a careless dresser." I stepped closer to Holmes, my medical training urging me to maintain a rational perspective amidst these escalating political tremors. "If Sir Reginald's cufflink was found in this study, Holmes, it places him at the scene of the crime, but the circumstances remain entirely contradictory. How does a man of Vance's stature become entangled with a political blackmailer like Lord Julian St. John? And more crucially, how does that connect to a locked room and a bullet through the temple?" "It connects, my dear Watson, because political blackmail is not a solitary enterprise," Holmes said, turning away from the window and pacing back toward the center of the room. His eyes were bright with the intense intellectual satisfaction of a chess player who has just foreseen a brilliant multi-move checkmate. A blackmailer requires a market for his wares. If Julian was accumulating names, dates, and cipher codes within the pages of his black ledger, he was not doing so merely to admire his own penmanship. He was preparing to sell those secrets to the highest bidder, or perhaps to foreign agents who would pay handsomely for a glimpse into Whitehall's diplomatic dispatches. Lord Arthur slowly recovered his footing, stepping forward from the bookshelf with a look of desperate urgency. "Julian would never commit treason, Mr. Holmes. Whatever his faults, and he had his share of youthful indiscretions, he was fiercely patriotic. He loved this country as much as any man. Patriotism, Lord Arthur, is frequently a flexible commodity when a man is pressed by heavy creditors or enticed by the intoxicating lure of absolute political leverage," Holmes observed gently, though there was no mistaking the hard edge of reality in his tone. "However, let us not rush to judgment regarding the late Lord Julian's motives until we have examined the most vital piece of evidence in this entire labyrinth, the black ledger itself." I looked around the room, realization dawning upon me. Lestrade took the ledger with him. "It is locked inside his coat pocket at Scotland Yard, or locked away in the Central Archives." "Indeed it is," Holmes agreed, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his thin lips. "Which means that Inspector Lestrade, quite unwittingly, is currently acting as the custodian of our most important piece of evidence, and as Scotland Yard is notoriously lax in its nocturnal security protocols, relying far more on bureaucratic complacency than on vigilant sentries, we shall simply have to pay a brief unannounced call upon the Yard before the dawn breaks." Lord Arthur blanched visibly. "Break into Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes, you speak of madness. That is a federal institution guarded by armed constables and detectives. It is a damp, draughty Victorian building populated largely by men who enjoy a pint of porter and a nap by the coal stove around 3 o'clock in the morning," Holmes corrected with a soft chuckle. "Do not distress yourself, Lord Arthur. You have performed your part admirably by bringing us here. Your carriage is waiting outside in the drive. I suggest you return home immediately, bolt your doors, and endeavor to get some sleep. Leave the remainder of the investigation to Watson and me." Our client hesitated, torn between his terror of public scandal and his desperate desire to uncover the truth behind his brother's demise. Ultimately, the quiet authority in Holmes' voice prevailed. Lord Arthur nodded stiffly, drew his coat tighter around his neck, and departed through the service entrance into the swirling fog of Belgravia. Once the heavy oak door had clicked shut behind him, Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Come, Watson," he said, reaching into the pocket of his Inverness cape and pulling out a pair of thick leather gloves. "The game is well and truly afoot. Let us see if Inspector Lestrade's filing cabinet possesses a more stubborn lock than the one we have just conquered." An hour later, the hansom cab dropped us a short distance from Scotland Yard, near the damp embankment where the sluggish waters of the Thames lapped against the stone walls with a hollow rhythmic sound. The metropolis was wrapped in a profound, eerie silence. The great clock of Westminster loomed through the yellow soup of the fog like a faceless monolith, tolling 3 in the morning as we slipped quietly through the side gates of the constabulary headquarters. Thanks to Holmes's encyclopedic knowledge of the metropolitan layout and his acquaintance with several of the more financially flexible night-duty inspectors, our entry into the building was accomplished with an ease that would have given Lestrade an apoplectic fit. We moved like ghosts down the dimly lit corridors, guided only by the pale circle of light from Holmes's pocket lantern, until we stood before the frosted glass door of Lestrade's private office. The lock upon the inspector's door was an old-fashioned brass Yale mechanism, a child's toy compared to the Chubb mortise we had bypassed earlier. Within 15 seconds, with a faint snick, the bolt yielded, and we stepped into the small, cluttered room that smelled strongly of cheap tobacco, ink, and stale coffee. Holmes did not waste a single second. He crossed directly to Lestrade's mahogany desk, where a row of heavy wooden filing boxes stood neatly aligned. He bypassed the general correspondence trays and immediately focused upon a small, locked iron cash box resting in the bottom drawer. "Here we are," Holmes murmured softly, producing a slender wire probe from his pocket. Lestrade was never a man of original thought. If he wished to secure a piece of evidence away from the prying eyes of his superiors, he would invariably stow it in the iron box beneath his desk rather than log it into the central registry. With a delicate twist of his wrist, the internal tumblers of the iron box gave way with a muffled click. Holmes lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting upon a bed of official police reports, was a slim notebook bound in stiff, grained black leather. Holmes lifted it out with reverence, carrying it over to the desk lamp, where he adjusted the green shade to cast a sharp, brilliant beam of light across the pages. I leaned over his shoulder, my heart beating a steady, anxious rhythm as Holmes carefully unlatched the leather strap and opened the cover to page 1. The handwriting within was immaculate, precise, copperplate script that revealed an extraordinary degree of discipline and calculation. At the top of the first page, written in black ink, was a date corresponding to the previous month, followed by a name, Sir Reginald Vance, £5,000. Beneath that entry were several columns of cipher codes, combinations of numbers and Greek letters that clearly corresponded to diplomatic dispatches or treaty negotiations. But it was not the first page that caught Holmes's attention. With rapid, practiced movements, he flipped through the middle sections of the ledger, his eyes scanning the names of prominent politicians, military commanders, and foreign attachés. Suddenly, Holmes' hand stopped. He froze, his lean fingers gripping the edge of the black leather cover so tightly that his knuckles turned stark white. I looked down at the page where his gaze had locked. The entry was dated just 2 days prior to Lord Julian's death. The name recorded at the top was not a British statesman nor a foreign agent. It was written in a hurried, trembling hand that broke away entirely from Julian's usual immaculate copperplate script, a hand that had clearly been forced or written under extreme duress. And beside the name, recorded in fresh, wet red ink, was a sum of money, followed by a chilling handwritten annotation, paid in full. The final ledger closed. Holmes stared at the name on the page, his breath catching in his throat. For the first time since I had known him, a look of genuine, unmitigated shock passed over his aristocratic features. He looked up at me, his dark eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. "Good God, Watson," Holmes whispered, the sound barely audible above the ticking of the office clock. "We have been looking at this entirely the wrong way. Lord Julian was not the blackmailer, he was the hostage." Chapter 5. The Cipher of the Black Ledger. The silence inside Inspector Lestrade's office grew heavy and suffocating, broken only by the steady metronomic dripping of a leaky tap down the corridor and the distant muffled whistle of a Thames tugboat cutting through the river fog. I stared down at the open page of the black ledger, the red ink annotation glaring back at us like a fresh wound. "A hostage, Holmes," I repeated, keeping my voice down to a strained whisper as I glanced toward the frosted glass door that led out into the dimly lit hallway. If Julian was not the mastermind behind this extortion ring, but rather a captive within his own home, who authored those entries? And how does that reconcile with the locked study and the fatal bullet wound? Holmes did not answer immediately. He had taken out his magnifying lens once more, holding it directly over the final, damning line of text where the red ink had pooled slightly before drying. His brow furrowed into a web of deep, analytical lines, his mind racing through a dozen competing hypotheses with the speed of a high-pressure engine. "Look closely at the stroke of the capital letters, Watson," Holmes commanded softly, his voice returning to its usual tone of calm, surgical precision. "Observe the slant. In the earlier entries, those detailing the transactions of Sir Reginald Vance and other members of the administration, the crossbars of the T's are swept sharply to the right with an effortless, arrogant flourish. That is the true hand of Lord Julian St. John, educated, meticulous, and supremely confident. He shifted the magnifying glass down to the final entry, the one scrawled in crimson ink just 48 hours before the tragedy. Now examine this," Holmes continued, pointing a fingernail at the cramped, uneven letters. "Notice how the vertical stems waver and crowd one another." The writer was gripping the pen with excessive, muscular tension, not the relaxed grip of a man recording accounts at a mahogany desk, but the desperate, white-knuckled grasp of a man whose hand was either trembling from profound terror or guided by another person altogether. "Forced compliance," I breathed, the medical reality of physical coercion dawning upon me. A gun held to his head while he wrote his own death warrant. Or an agreement signed under the immediate threat of total annihilation, Holmes corrected grimly. He gently closed the black ledger, slipped it beneath his Inverness cape, and locked Lestrade's iron cash-box with a quiet, practiced click of his wire probe. "Let us return to Baker Street before the morning shift of the constabulary arrives to spoil our triumph. We have the ledger, we have the silver cufflink, and we have established that the official theory propounded by Scotland Yard is nothing more than a convenient fiction designed to protect men in high places." By dawn, the yellow fog had lifted slightly, replaced by a raw, biting frost that coated the cobbles of Baker Street in a thin sheet of glittering white. Mrs. Hudson had not yet risen, leaving the second-floor sitting-room quiet and undisturbed, save for the embers of our coal fire, which still glowed a dull, welcoming red in the hearth. Holmes immediately set to work upon the mahogany side table, clearing away his chemical retorts to make room for the black ledger. He laid it flat beneath the brilliant morning light streaming through the grime-streaked window, snapping open his pocket toolkit to retrieve a small scalpel and a set of fine-tipped tweezers. "Holmes," I said, sinking into my leather armchair with a steaming mug of black coffee I had hastily brewed over the spirit lamp. "If Julian was being blackmailed or held hostage, who was the true extortionist? The presence of Sir Reginald Vance's cufflink at the scene suggests the Under-Secretary was deeply entangled. Could Vance have murdered Julian to silence him permanently? Sir Reginald is far too timid a creature to commit a murder with his own hands," Holmes replied without looking up, his eyes locked upon the binding of the black ledger. "Men of Vance's station delegate their dirty work to more robust instruments. They operate through intermediaries, fixers, political brokers, and men who inhabit the murky underworld between Whitehall and the East End docks." With surgical dexterity, Holmes inserted the tip of his scalpel into the inner spine of the ledger, working along the heavy cardboard backing. "What are you doing?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "A ledger of this quality, bound in fine calfskin with marbled endpapers, is rarely a simple notebook," Holmes murmured, his breath forming a light cloud in the chilly room. "It possesses a double lining. Crafty accountants and professional spies frequently utilize concealed pockets within the binding to store documents too sensitive for the pages themselves. Watch, Watson." With a soft, fibrous tear, the inner lining of the back cover peeled away from the cardboard frame. A small folded square of thick, cream-colored stationery slipped out from the hidden recess, fluttering softly down onto the mahogany tabletop. It did not bear a governmental watermark, nor did it carry the crest of the Privy Council. Instead, it was embossed with the simple, elegant insignia of a private gentleman's club located near St. James's, the Diogenes Club. Holmes used his tweezers to unfold the paper with infinite care. Spread across the sheet was a neat typewritten message, a modern technological convenience that bypassed the telltale evidence of handwritten penmanship entirely, accompanied by a handwritten postscript at the bottom. I stood up and leaned over the table, reading the words aloud over Holmes's shoulder. "Lord Julian St. John. The final installment of the dossier concerning the Mediterranean naval contracts must be delivered in full tonight at the rendezvous point. Failure to comply will result in the immediate distribution of the complete transcript to the Prime Minister and the daily press. Bring the black ledger. Come alone. Beneath the typewritten text, scrawled in the same frantic red-inked handwriting we had observed in the ledger's final entry, was a chilling postscript. I have no choice. He is waiting at the docks. I stared at the paper, a cold shiver running down my spine. The Mediterranean naval contracts, good Lord, Holmes, that is not merely a political scandal, that touches upon the national security of the entire British Empire. If those contracts fell into foreign hands, the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean would shift overnight, and the Admiralty would be plunged into a crisis from which it might never recover. Holmes finished for me, his eyes gleaming with cold, absolute resolve. He reached into his pocket and retrieved the silver cufflink bearing the heraldic lion of Sir Reginald Vance. And yet, Holmes continued, placing the cufflink beside the recovered letter, Sir Reginald's cufflink was found on the study floor, miles away from the docks where Julian met his end. Why would an undersecretary drop his personal jewelry inside a locked room if the final confrontation took place elsewhere? A plant, I suggested, the pieces beginning to align in my medical legal mind. A deliberate attempt to frame Sir Reginald, or perhaps a sign of a violent struggle that occurred inside the study before Julian ever reached the rendezvous point. Precisely, Watson, Holmes said, a crisp smile breaking across his features. A struggle did occur in that study, but it was not between Julian and Sir Reginald. It was between Julian and the man who held the leash, an intermediary who was sent to seize the ledger by force, but who failed to notice that Julian had already concealed the true documents within the spine of the book. Holmes rose from the table, his tall frame straightening with decisive energy as he walked over to the coat rack and pulled down his heavy wool overcoat and deerstalker cap. "Where are we going?" I asked, reaching automatically for my service revolver from the sideboard drawer and slipping it into my pocket. "To verify our hypothesis, my dear Watson," Holmes replied, pulling on his leather gloves with a sharp snap. "We are going to visit a man who knows every secret, every whisper, and every illicit financial transaction that passes through the West End, and if my calculations are correct, he is currently awaiting a visitor who will pay handsomely for the contents of the pocket we have just emptied." Chapter 6. The Oracle of Pall Mall. The yellow fog of the previous evening had entirely vanished by the time we stepped out onto the pavement of Baker Street, replaced by a biting crystalline frost that seemed to snap and crackle beneath the soles of our boots. The sky above London was a pale, flawless blue, stripped of its usual coal smoke canopy by a brisk, cutting wind blowing in from the east. It was a morning that demanded vigorous action, completely at odds with the murky subterranean labyrinth of blackmail and political treachery we were currently navigating. We did not summon a carriage. Holmes insisted that the sharp winter air would serve to clear the residual cobwebs from our minds, and so we set off on foot, our breath pluming in great white clouds before us. We walked at a punishing pace down Oxford Street, turning south through the bustling morning crowds toward the aristocratic quietude of St. James's. "I presume, Holmes, from the direction of our march, that we are heading toward Pall Mall," I observed, quickening my stride to keep pace with his long, nervous legs. The embossed watermark upon that typewritten note was quite distinctive. "Are we to pay a visit to the Diogenes Club?" "Your geographical deductions are faultless, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes fixed dead ahead, his collar turned up against the biting wind. "The Diogenes Club is precisely our destination. When one is dealing with matters that threaten the structural integrity of the British Empire, and the Mediterranean naval contracts most assuredly fall into that perilous category, there is only one man in London to whom one can safely turn, a man who does not merely observe the government, but who in many respects is the government." "Your brother, Mycroft," I said, a sense of profound anticipation settling over me. "Exactly," Holmes agreed. "Mycroft possesses a brain that is geometrically superior to my own, though he lacks the physical energy to verify his own brilliant conclusions. He sits in his leather armchair in the stranger's room, digesting the daily dispatches from every embassy in Europe, cross-referencing treaties, tariffs, and naval deployments, with the effortless grace of a mathematician solving a child's arithmetic puzzle. If the Undersecretary is entangled in this mess, Mycroft will know the exact dimensions of the web. We turned onto Pall Mall, leaving the commercial clatter of the city behind. The Diogenes Club stood as a monument to Victorian lethargy, a grand, imposing edifice of Portland stone, its tall, unwashed windows staring blankly out at the street. It was, as Holmes had often described it, the queerest club in London, populated entirely by the most unsociable and unclubbable men in the metropolis. No member was permitted to take the least notice of any other, and talking was strictly prohibited save in the designated strangers' room. Holmes pushed open the heavy oak doors, and we were immediately swallowed by an atmosphere of hushed, almost oppressive silence. The carpets were thick enough to absorb the sound of a marching regiment, and the few members we passed in the dimly lit corridors resembled ancient mummified pharaohs entombed in leather armchairs behind copies of the Times. We were ushered by a silent velvet-footed attendant into the strangers' room, a modest wood-paneled chamber overlooking the rear courtyard. We had not been waiting more than 5 minutes before the door opened and Mycroft Holmes entered. He was a massive man, heavily built and corpulent, possessing a physical inertia that stood in sharp, almost comical contrast to the electric, coiled spring vitality of my friend. Yet, above his heavy jowls and vast, sloping shoulders sat a head so masterful, so endowed with the unmistakable spark of supreme intellect, that one immediately forgot his physical ungainliness. His eyes, watery and light grey, held the same piercing, microscopic intensity that I knew so well in Sherlock. "Ah, Sherlock," Mycroft said, his voice a surprisingly high, reedy tenor that echoed softly in the quiet room. He settled himself into the largest armchair with a heavy sigh, resting his thick hands upon his knees. "I expected you would call upon me before noon. The tragic business at Malvern House, I presume?" "Your omniscience is in fine form this morning, Mycroft," Holmes replied, stripping off his leather gloves and tossing them onto the table alongside his deerstalker cap. "Hardly omniscience, my dear boy," Mycroft chuckled, his vast chest heaving slightly. "Merely the application of logic to the morning dispatches. The police report of Lord St. John's supposed suicide reached my desk at 8 o'clock. By 9 I received a frantic, coded telegram from the Admiralty regarding a missing portfolio of dreadnought schematics. When a heavily indebted aristocrat with political connections dies violently on the exact night that top-secret naval contracts vanish, one does not need to be a seer to draw the connecting line, and I see by the smudge of red sealing wax upon Dr. Watson's left cuff that you have already taken the liberty of bypassing Scotland Yard's security cordons. I glanced down at my sleeve in astonishment, hurriedly brushing away the tiny crimson flake that had adhered to the wool during our midnight excursion to the late Lord's study. Sherlock merely smiled. He reached into his heavy overcoat and withdrew the black ledger, laying it carefully upon the low table separating us from his brother. Beside it he placed the typewritten note bearing the Diogenes Club watermark, and finally the silver cufflink of the Under-Secretary. Mycroft's heavy eyelids drooped as he leaned forward, his watery eyes scanning the items with terrifying speed. He did not touch the ledger, nor did he read the pages. He merely absorbed the visual evidence in a single, comprehensive sweep. "The typewritten note was concealed within the binding of the ledger, I take it?" Mycroft asked lazily, leaning back into the leather upholstery. "It was," Sherlock confirmed. "The final entry in the ledger was written under severe duress, in red ink, indicating the debt was paid in full. The Under-Secretary's cufflink was found partially concealed beneath the mahogany desk in the locked study." Mycroft let out a long, slow breath, pressing his thick fingertips together. A clumsy frame-up, almost insulting in its elementary construction. "You have of course realized that the Under-Secretary did not drop that cufflink last night." "I suspected as much," Sherlock replied, his eyes gleaming. "The man is far too cautious to lose his jewellery at the scene of an extortion." "He did not lose it at Malvern House," Mycroft stated with absolute authority. "He lost it here, in the cloakroom of this very club, precisely 3 weeks ago. He lodged a formal complaint with the hall porter, fearing a servant had pilfered it. Clearly, someone with access to the club's facilities pocketed the item, preserving it for the express purpose of planting it at the scene of the crime." "To throw the scent off the true conspirator," I interjected, leaning forward. But who would possess the audacity to blackmail members of the Foreign Office, steal naval contracts, and murder an English lord in his own study? Mycroft turned his pale grey eyes upon me, his expression turning unusually grave. "You are operating under a fundamental misconception, Dr. Watson," Mycroft said softly. "The deceased lord was not the mastermind. He was a pawn, a convenient, well-connected aristocratic mule used to transport sensitive information from Whitehall to the buyers. The man who orchestrated this enterprise is of a very different caliber. He is an international broker of state secrets, known in the diplomatic underground simply as the Albatross." Sherlock stiffened, his jaw tightening. The Albatross. I have encountered the aliases of his subordinates in the past, but the man himself is a ghost. He operates entirely through intermediaries. "Until now," Mycroft corrected, tapping a thick finger against the armrest. "The Mediterranean naval contracts are too valuable to entrust to underlings. The Ottoman Empire and the Russian Tsar are currently engaged in a bidding war that would stagger the imagination. The portfolio contains the precise armor plating specifications and torpedo deployment schedules for our entire fleet stationed at Malta and Alexandria. If those schematics are delivered, our naval supremacy in the Mediterranean is nullified. We would be entirely blind and defenseless in the Suez." "The typewritten note," Sherlock said, pointing to the cream-colored stationery on the table, "demands that the final installment of the dossier be delivered tonight at the rendezvous point. The postscript from the deceased lord indicates the buyer was waiting at the docks." "The East End docks," Mycroft agreed, his tone heavy with impending doom. "Specifically, the abandoned warehouses near Wapping Old Stairs. The Albatross has chartered a private steam yacht, the Lorelei, currently anchored in the estuary under a neutral flag. The documents were meant to be exchanged at midnight last night." I felt a cold sweat break out along my spine despite the warmth of the roaring fire in the grate. "But if the lord is dead, and the ledger was left behind, the exchange never took place," Sherlock finished, his voice ringing with sudden, triumphant clarity. He sprang from his chair, his eyes blazing with the fierce, predatory light of a hound catching the scent. "The Albatross sent one of his thugs to Malvern House to ensure the lord's compliance. A struggle ensued, the lord was killed, and the thug fled, locking the door behind him and planting the stolen cufflink to incriminate the government. But the thug failed to find the actual naval contracts because the deceased lord had already hidden them." "And they are not in the black ledger," Mycroft observed, gesturing lazily toward the table. "I can see from the compression of the binding that the pocket is empty save for that typewritten note." "Exactly, Mycroft." Sherlock began to pace the narrow confines of the stranger's room, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "The lord knew he was being followed. He knew his life was forfeit. He left the ledger on the desk as a decoy, complete with a forged final entry to satisfy the blackmailer's agent. But the portfolio itself, the dreadnought schematics, are hidden elsewhere. You have precisely 12 hours to find them, Sherlock," Mycroft said, his high voice dropping to a register of deadly earnestness. "The Lorelei sets sail with the midnight tide. The Albatross will not leave London empty-handed. His agents are scouring the city at this very moment. If they locate the portfolio before you do, the British government will face a crisis of unprecedented proportions. I cannot dispatch the official police. Lestrade and his men are too heavy-handed and would trigger an international incident if they board a neutral vessel without absolute proof." "They shall not be needed," Sherlock said, his lips curling into a grim, predatory smile. He snatched up his gloves and his deerstalker. "The true battle of wits is between the Albatross and myself. Come, Watson, we have a portfolio to hunt down and an international espionage ring to dismantle before the Thames whittles them whole." "Where do we begin?" I asked, scrambling to my feet and buttoning my coat against the impending chill. "By re-examining the one detail Scotland Yard dismissed as irrelevant," Holmes declared, his hand already upon the brass doorknob of the stranger's room. "The piece of the railway timetable we found crushed beneath the mahogany desk. It was torn, Watson, torn down the center. Why would a man tear a timetable in half unless he wished to separate the arrival time from the destination?" Before I could answer, Holmes had already swept out into the silent, heavily carpeted corridor of the Diogenes Club. Mycroft offered me a solemn, slow nod of his massive head, a silent benediction from the highest echelons of the British Empire, and returned his attention to the roaring fire, his heavy eyelids drooping once more into deceptive lethargy. I hurried after my friend, bursting out of the oppressive silence of the club and back into the biting, frosty air of Pall Mall. The stakes of our quiet, domestic murder investigation had suddenly erupted into a desperate race against the clock, with the fate of the nation's naval supremacy hanging delicately in the balance. The great game was afoot, and the shadows of the East End were waiting to claim us. Chapter 7. The Phantom at the Terminus. The biting frost of Pall Mall seemed to penetrate the very marrow of my bones as we hurried away from the imposing stone facade of the Diogenes Club. The sky above the metropolis had brightened into a hard, unforgiving azure, yet the weak winter sun offered no warmth against the cutting easterly wind. I strode alongside Sherlock Holmes, my mind reeling from the staggering geopolitical implications that Mycroft had so casually laid before us. A domestic tragedy in a locked room had suddenly expanded into a shadowy contest for the naval supremacy of the British Empire, and the invisible clock ticking down toward midnight echoed relentlessly in my ears. Holmes moved with the rapid, purposeful stride of a bloodhound that had finally caught a fresh scent upon the wind. His lean figure cut through the morning crowds of clerks and merchants like the prow of a cutter navigating a choppy sea. He did not speak until we had hailed a passing hansom cab at the corner of Trafalgar Square, instructing the driver to make for Baker Street with the utmost haste. Once settled within the leather interior, he withdrew the crumpled, torn fragment of the railway timetable from his pocket, holding it up to the pale light filtering through the cab's rattling window. "The torn edge, Watson," Holmes began, his eyes narrowing as he traced the jagged line of the paper with his gloved index finger. "Consider the psychology of the act. A man does not tear a piece of paper in half without a specific urgent motive. If Lord Julian merely wished to discard the timetable, he would have crumpled it or tossed it into the hearth. To tear it precisely down the middle, separating the destination from the arrival times, suggests a deliberate attempt to conceal the location of the rendezvous from a casual observer, or from the very man who stood over him in that study, demanding the black ledger. But the fragment we possess clearly reads, "Midnight, the cliffs, do not fail," I pointed out, leaning forward to inspect the scrap. Does that not point unequivocally to the Kentish coast? Dover, perhaps, or Folkestone? It aligns with the scheduled express trains departing Victoria Station. "Ah, the seductive danger of the obvious conclusion," Holmes murmured, a faint, patronizing smile playing upon his thin lips. "You look, my dear doctor, but you do not observe. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly one begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. You see the word cliffs, and immediately envision the chalky white precipices of Dover, but examine the typography of the timetable itself. Notice the serif upon the letter M and the heavy black letter printing of the schedule columns. This is not a product of the London, Chatham and Dover railway presses. I took the fragment from his outstretched hand, squinting at the small, densely printed numbers. If it is not the Dover Express, then what is it? "It is a schedule for the London and South Western Railway," Holmes declared with absolute certainty, leaning back against the squabs. "Specifically, it is a local timetable governing the goods lines and freight yards that snake through the industrial sectors of the East End and the docks, and the handwritten note, 'the cliffs,' does not refer to a geological formation by the sea. It refers to Clifford's Wharf, a dilapidated and largely abandoned timber yard situated on the northern bank of the Thames, less than half a mile from Wapping Old Stairs. It is a notorious haven for smugglers, opium runners, and men who prefer the cloak of absolute darkness." I felt a sudden jolt of adrenaline as the pieces clicked seamlessly into place. "Then the Mediterranean naval contracts are hidden at Clifford's Wharf?" "Not necessarily," Holmes cautioned, his dark eyes glittering with intense intellectual concentration. "Lord Julian was a desperate man, but he was not a fool. He knew that the Albatross would have men watching the wharf, waiting to intercept the portfolio. He would not carry the documents on his person, nor would he leave them sitting unprotected in a timber yard. He required a secure, neutral location, a place where a package could be deposited anonymously and retrieved only by someone possessing a specific token. Look again at the smudge of grease upon the corner of the paper." I held the paper closer to the window. You mentioned earlier that it was a mixture of grease and coal dust, the signature of a railway terminus. Precisely, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But not just any coal dust. This particular smudge contains microscopic particles of anthracite, a hard smokeless coal used exclusively by the subterranean Metropolitan Railway to prevent the underground tunnels from choking with soot. Lord Julian did not travel to the docks directly. He stopped at an underground terminus. And what do all major railway terminuses possess, Watson, that would prove infinitely useful to a man attempting to hide a bulky portfolio of naval blueprints? A left luggage office, I cried, striking my knee with my fist. Exactly. Holmes' eyes flashed with triumph. He checked the portfolio into a cloakroom, received a numbered ticket in return, and subsequently went to the rendezvous to negotiate for his life, or perhaps to bargain for safe passage out of the country. When the negotiations failed, and the blackmailer's agent murdered him in his study, the agent searched the room for the ticket. But Julian had anticipated the violence. He slipped the luggage ticket inside the spine of a book, behind a loose floorboard, or perhaps... Holmes paused, his gaze dropping once more to the torn scrap of paper in his hand. He went perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat. "Good heavens," Holmes whispered, a look of profound, almost reverent awe washing over his sharp features. "The brilliance of a cornered mind. Look at the jagged edge of the tear, Watson. Look at the thickness of the paper itself." I peered at it, thoroughly bewildered. "It is ordinary timetable paper, Holmes, perhaps slightly thicker than usual." "It is not a timetable at all," Holmes exclaimed, his voice ringing with sudden electric energy. He tapped the paper vigorously. "The printed text is merely a facade. This is a piece of heavy cardstock, cleverly glued to the back of a standard railway schedule. Do you not see the faint watermark pressed into the lower corner, just where the tier ends? It is the insignia of the Charing Cross Station cloakroom. The timetable was not a clue to the destination. The torn paper is the luggage ticket itself, disguised to look like a piece of refuse." I stared at him in utter astonishment. "Then the other half of the ticket is required to claim the package," Holmes finished, his eyes blazing. Lord Julian tore the ticket in half. He left one piece in his study to taunt his murderers, or perhaps as a desperate breadcrumb for the authorities to find. He must have hidden the other half somewhere else, or mailed it to a trusted confederate. But a desperate man with a loaded revolver and a forged signature might just persuade a weary cloakroom clerk to overlook a torn ticket. "We must get to Charing Cross immediately." Holmes struck the roof of the cab with his walking stick, shouting fresh instructions to the driver. The hansom lurched violently as the horse was whipped into a sudden, aggressive turn, its hooves clattering wildly against the frosted cobblestones. The cab tilted at a perilous angle, threatening to capsize as we hurtled back toward the Strand. The journey to Charing Cross was a blur of frantic motion and breathless anticipation. Holmes sat on the edge of his seat, his pocket watch resting open in his palm, counting the seconds with grim intensity. If Mycroft's assessment of the Albatross was correct, the international broker would not be sitting idly by. His agents were likely tearing London apart, searching for the very portfolio that currently rested in a dusty cubbyhole at the station. When our cab finally skidded to a halt beneath the soaring iron-ribbed canopy of Charing Cross Station, Holmes tossed a handful of silver coins to the bewildered driver and vaulted out into the chaotic throng of travelers. I followed close on his heels, pushing my way through the dense crowds of morning commuters, the air thick with the hissing of steam engines, the shrill blasts of conductor whistles, and the pungent, unmistakable aroma of hot metal and burning coal. We navigated the concourse with desperate speed, dodging porters pushing heavy brass luggage carts and well-dressed passengers hurrying toward the ticket barriers. Holmes' eyes darted relentlessly across the vast cavernous hall, scanning the signage until he spotted the dull brass placard reading "Left luggage and cloakroom" tucked away in a shadowed alcove near the northern exits. As we approached the wooden counter, my heart sank. A heated argument was already underway. Standing before the wire mesh window of the cloakroom was a man of imposing physical stature, clad in a heavy, grease-stained seaman's reefer jacket and a pulled-down flat cap that obscured the upper half of his face. His shoulders were broad and heavily muscled, and he was leaning aggressively against the counter, speaking in a low, menacing growl to a terrified elderly railway clerk. "I told you, old man," the brute snarled, his voice carrying a rough, guttural accent that spoke of the dockyards and the criminal rookeries of the East End. "The governor lost the other half of the ticket, but I have the number right here, number 417, a heavy leather portfolio. Hand it over, and there's a gold sovereign in it for your trouble. Refuse, and I'll pull you through this wire and break your neck." The elderly clerk trembled, clutching a thick ledger to his chest. "I cannot, sir. It is strictly against railway regulations. Without the complete ticket, I cannot release the item. The station master would have my position." "Your position won't matter when you're dead," the thug hissed, reaching a massive calloused hand through the small opening in the wire mesh, attempting to seize the terrified clerk by the collar. "I believe the gentleman said no." Holmes's voice rang out behind the brute, cold, sharp, and commanding as a drawn sword. The thug whipped around, dropping his hand from the wire mesh. His face was a map of brutality, a flattened nose, a jagged scar running from his temple to his jawline, and small pig-like eyes that burned with malicious intent. He took one look at Holmes's tall, austere figure, and my own hand resting firmly upon the handle of the revolver in my coat pocket, and his lips curled into a vicious sneer. "Mind your own business, toff," the thug spat, shifting his weight onto the balls of his feet. "This ain't a matter for the likes of you." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, stepping smoothly forward, his walking stick held lightly in his right hand. "It is very much my business. You see, you are attempting to claim a package that belongs to a dead man, and I have a distinct aversion to grave robbers." The recognition flashed in the brute's eyes, a sudden dawning realization that he was facing the very detective who had dismantled half the criminal enterprises in London. With a guttural roar of fury, he did not reach for the package, nor did he attempt to argue. Instead, he lunged forward, swinging a fist the size of a ham directly at Holmes' head. Holmes did not flinch. With the effortless grace of a master practitioner of Baritsu, he pivoted sharply on his heel, allowing the massive fist to sail harmlessly past his ear. In the same fluid motion, Holmes brought the heavy silver pommel of his walking stick crashing down upon the brute's exposed wrist. A sickening crack echoed over the din of the station, followed by a roar of agony from the thug. He stumbled backward, clutching his shattered wrist, his eyes wide with pain and shock. But the man was a creature of the dockyards, hardened by a lifetime of violence. Rather than pressing the attack, he turned on his heel and violently shoved his way into the dense crowd of passengers pouring out of a newly arrived commuter train. "Watson, stop him," Holmes shouted, though he did not move to give chase himself. I drew my revolver and sprinted after the fleeing man, pushing through the wall of indignant travelers. But the brute was fast, using his immense bulk to plow a path through the screaming crowd. By the time I reached the main exit leading out onto the Strand, the man had vanished into the swirling sea of hansom cabs, omnibuses, and pedestrians. The phantom of the terminus had escaped. I returned to the cloakroom, holstering my weapon with a heavy sigh of frustration. Holmes was leaning casually against the wooden counter, speaking in low, soothing tones to the trembling elderly clerk. "I apologize for the disturbance, my good man," Holmes was saying, sliding the torn half of our ticket through the wire mesh. "I believe this is the matching fragment for item number 417. If you would be so kind as to retrieve the portfolio, we shall relieve you of this dangerous burden." The clerk, still pale and shaking, took the torn fragment, matched it to his ledger, and disappeared into the dusty rows of shelving behind him. A moment later he returned, sliding a heavy waterproof canvas portfolio secured with brass buckles across the counter. Holmes rested his gloved hands upon the canvas, his eyes dark and unfathomable. We had secured the Mediterranean naval contracts, but as Holmes looked toward the exits where the thug had vanished, I knew the victory was hollow. The Albatross now knew exactly who held his prize, and the true battle for the survival of the British fleet was only just beginning. Chapter 8. The Decoy of Whitehall. The biting frost of the morning had yielded to a cold, brilliant afternoon by the time we returned to the familiar environs of Baker Street. The sky above London was a flawless, brittle blue, swept clean of the morning fog by a relentless easterly wind that rattled the chimney pots. The pale winter sun cast long, sharp-edged shadows across the pavement as our hansom cab clattered to a halt before number 221B. We ascended the 17 steps to our quarters in a state of high tension, the heavy canvas portfolio secured firmly beneath my arm. I felt as though I were carrying a live bomb, one capable of blowing the entire Mediterranean fleet out of the water if it detonated in the wrong hands. Mrs. Hudson had tended the fire during our absence, and the sitting room was pleasantly warm, though the atmosphere between Holmes and myself remained taut with unspoken urgency. Holmes stripped off his Inverness cape and deerstalker, tossing them carelessly upon the Persian sofa. He did not pause to warm his hands by the grate, nor did he reach for his customary clay pipe. Instead, he cleared the mahogany center table with a single sweeping gesture of his arm, sending a stack of old telegraphic forms and a medical journal fluttering to the floorboards. "Place it here, Watson," Holmes commanded, his voice vibrating with suppressed energy. "Let us ascertain the precise nature of the prize for which Lord Julian St. John paid with his life, and for which our scarred friend at the terminus was willing to risk the gallows." I laid the canvas portfolio upon the polished wood. It was an unexceptional object to look upon, dull olive in color, heavily reinforced at the corners with thick leather, and secured by 3 stout brass buckles, yet it emanated an aura of profound geopolitical weight. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfastened the thick leather straps. The flap fell back, revealing a thick sheaf of large blue-tinted drafting papers, meticulously rolled and bound in crimson ribbon. Holmes produced his silver pocket-knife and neatly severed the ribbon. The heavy blueprints unrolled with a crisp, authoritative crackle, spreading out across the entirety of the table. They were magnificent specimens of naval architecture, detailed cross-sections of steam-powered dreadnoughts, intricate schematics of rotating gun turrets, and precise mathematical tables detailing the thickness of Harvey steel armor plating covered the pages in immaculate white ink. The crest of the Admiralty was stamped boldly in the upper right corner of each sheet, accompanied by the countersignature of the First Sea Lord. "Good heavens, Holmes," I breathed, leaning over the table to trace the line of a massive naval gun barrel with my index finger. "It is all here, the complete Mediterranean deployment. If the Tsar's agents or the Ottoman diplomats had laid eyes upon these, our strategic supremacy in the Suez would have been entirely compromised. Lord Julian had indeed stolen the crown jewels of the British Navy." Holmes did not reply immediately. He had already produced his double convex magnifying lens and was bent nearly in half over the table, his hawk-like nose hovering mere inches from the surface of the blueprints. His eyes darted across the mathematical columns and drafting lines with the frantic, calculating speed of a master mathematician. For several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the mantel clock and the harsh, rhythmic rasp of Holmes's breathing. Then, quite suddenly, his movements ceased. The relentless pacing of his gaze halted upon a specific cluster of numbers near the bottom left margin of the third blueprint, a detailed schematic of a torpedo deployment tube. He remained frozen in that position for what felt like an eternity, his body locked in an attitude of intense, almost painful concentration. "Holmes?" I ventured, breaking the oppressive silence. "What is it? Have you found something amiss?" When my friend finally straightened up, his face was a mask of impenetrable calm, yet his eyes burned with a fierce, suppressed light. Without a word to me, he reached into his waistcoat pocket, produced a small pair of silver tweezers, and delicately scraped a minute fleck of blue pigment from the very edge of the paper. He deposited this microscopic crumb into a glass vial, corked it securely, and vanished it back into his pocket. "Amiss, my dear Watson," Holmes repeated softly, a strange, enigmatic smile playing about his thin lips. "Nothing is amiss. In fact, everything is proceeding with an elegant, almost mathematical inevitability. It is a brilliant piece of work, truly a masterpiece of bureaucratic drafting." Before I could question him further upon his cryptic behavior, the sharp, imperative clatter of heavy boots sounded upon our stairs. The tread was unmistakably official, lacking entirely the cautious hesitation of a civilian client. The door to our sitting room was thrown open with a brusque, authoritative force, and Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard marched across the threshold, his sallow face flushed with exertion and triumph. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade barked, rubbing his hands together as he took in the scene before him. "I had a feeling I might find you up to your neck in this business. We received a report from the railway police at Charing Cross not an hour ago, a violent altercation in the left luggage office involving a gentleman matching your description and a known dockyard ruffian. It did not require the deductive genius of Baker Street to conclude that you had located the missing property. Lestrade's ferret-like eyes immediately fell upon the unrolled blueprints upon the table. He stepped forward, a look of profound relief washing over his sharp features as he recognized the Admiralty crest. "By George, you've actually done it," the inspector breathed, reaching out to touch the heavy drafting paper as if verifying its physical reality. "The Mediterranean naval contracts. The Home Secretary has been in a panic all morning, and the Admiralty threatened to turn the Metropolitan Police upside down. You have saved us a monumental scandal, Mr. Holmes." "I merely retrieved a piece of misplaced luggage, Inspector," Holmes replied lazily, throwing himself down upon the sofa and steepling his long fingers beneath his chin. "I assume you have come to relieve us of the burden." "Indeed I have," Lestrade said, rolling the blueprints back up with far less reverence than Holmes had shown, and stuffing them unceremoniously into the canvas portfolio. He buckled the leather straps tightly. "I have a closed carriage waiting below, flanked by 2 armed constables. This portfolio will be in the central vault at Whitehall within the half-hour. Sir Reginald Vance and the Prime Minister will be singularly grateful for your discretion in this matter, Holmes." "And what of Lord Julian St. John?" I asked, unable to conceal my distaste for the inspector's smug, bureaucratic satisfaction. "What of his murder and the blackmail ring that drove him to it?" Lestrade waved a dismissive hand, securing the portfolio beneath his arm. "The matter is officially closed, Dr. Watson. Lord Julian was a desperate man ruined by his own treacherous greed. When his buyers failed to meet his demands, or perhaps threatened to expose him, the coward took his own life in his study. We have the stolen property back, and the government's secrets are safe. There is no benefit to the Crown in dragging the St. John family name through the mud of a public trial. The blackmailer, whoever he may be, has lost his prize and will likely scurry back into the shadows. A tidy conclusion to a very nasty business." I looked at Holmes, expecting him to leap from the sofa and tear Lestrade's convenient, politically motivated theory to shreds. I expected him to mention the forced handwriting in the black ledger, the silver cufflink planted at the scene, and the clear evidence of a struggle in the locked room. But to my profound astonishment, Holmes merely closed his eyes and nodded slowly. "A tidy conclusion indeed, Lestrade," Holmes murmured, his voice dripping with an indolence that I knew to be entirely feigned. "You have your naval contracts, and Scotland Yard has preserved the dignity of the Foreign Office. I wish you a safe journey back to Whitehall." Lestrade, beaming with self-importance, tipped his bowler hat to us and marched out of the room, the heavy footsteps echoing down the stairs until the front door slammed shut, rattling the window panes. "Holmes," I cried the moment the carriage wheels clattered away down the street, "are you mad? You have just allowed Lestrade to walk away with the sole piece of leverage we possessed, and you permitted him to propagate that absurd suicide theory when we both know Lord Julian was murdered by an agent of the Albatross. Why did you not show him the evidence of the forgery?" Holmes opened his eyes, the feigned lethargy vanishing instantly, replaced by a gaze of terrifying, predatory sharpness. He sprang from the sofa, walked over to the mantelpiece, and retrieved his violin. "Because, my dear Watson," Holmes said, drawing the bow lightly across the strings to produce a single haunting note, "Lestrade is a necessary pawn in a much larger game. He is currently racing toward Whitehall to present the Home Secretary with a portfolio of utter uselessness. The blueprints he carries under his arm, the very blueprints for which Lord Julian was murdered, are nothing more than elaborate, beautifully executed forgeries." I stared at him, utterly dumbfounded, the breath knocked completely from my lungs. Forgeries, but the Admiralty crest, the mathematical tables, I saw them with my own eyes. "You saw what you were intended to see, Watson," Holmes replied, his bow moving faster now, weaving a complex, frantic melody that filled the sitting room with nervous energy. "The crest was stamped perfectly, yes, but the ink—" When I examined the third schematic, I noticed a subtle inconsistency in the drafting lines of the torpedo tubes. The specifications called for an aperture of 18 inches, a standard size for the fleet 5 years ago, but entirely obsolete for the new Mediterranean dreadnoughts, which require a 21-inch clearance. He paused his playing for a fraction of a second to look at me, his eyes burning. Lord Julian St. John was a traitor, Watson, but he was not a fool. He knew that stealing the genuine plans would sign his own death warrant the moment they were missed. So, he accessed the archives, retrieved a set of outdated, rejected schematics, and spent weeks meticulously altering the dates and the class designations. He intended to sell the Albatross a worthless pile of paper. "Then the real contracts are still safe at the Admiralty," I exclaimed, feeling a sudden surge of relief. "No," Holmes corrected grimly, resuming his frantic playing. "The real contracts are missing. Lord Julian removed them to delay discovery, but he hid them elsewhere. The Albatross, however, does not know this. He believes the true contracts were in that portfolio, and when his network of spies within Whitehall informs him that Lestrade has recovered the documents, he will realize he has been cheated. But if Lestrade has the forgeries, what is our next move?" I asked, my mind struggling to keep pace with his rapid deductions. "Our next move is to wait," Holmes said, turning toward the window. "The Albatross is a creature of immense pride. He will not accept defeat. Once he learns the portfolio is in Whitehall, he will turn his wrath upon the men who foiled his dockyard agent. He knows Sherlock Holmes possesses the intellect to unravel his conspiracy. He will come for us, Watson, and when he does, we shall be ready to spring the trap." Chapter 9. The Trap at the Gallery. The hours that followed Inspector Lestrade's departure were marked by a silence in Baker Street so profound it felt like the held breath of a predator. Holmes had retreated into the furthest reaches of his own mind, his violin silenced, his tall frame once again draped across the Persian sofa like a dormant shadow. He did not eat, he did not speak, and he did not stir as the afternoon sun dipped low behind the chimney pots, casting long ochre fingers of light across our cluttered sitting room. I sat in my armchair, my revolver within easy reach, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional muffled rumble of a passing carriage. I knew, with the instinctive dread that accompanies any association with my friend, that we were the bait in a trap of Holmes's own devising. He had allowed the inspector to carry away the worthless forgeries, knowing full well that when the truth was discovered at Whitehall, or when the Albatross's own intelligence network confirmed the fraud, the retaliation would be swift, violent, and directed squarely at 221B. "He will come tonight," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the twilight gloom with the precision of a scalpel. He had not moved, but his eyes were wide open, staring into the heart of the dying fire. "The Albatross is not a man who tolerates being made a fool. The humiliation of the botched robbery at Charing Cross, combined with the loss of the ledger, will have driven him to a frenzy. He has reached the conclusion that I possess the genuine schematics, and he will stop at nothing to retrieve them." "If he knows you have them, why hasn't he struck already?" I asked, rising and walking over to the window to peer out into the thickening fog of the street below. "The city is crawling with his agents, because he is playing a game of patience," Holmes replied, rising lithely from the sofa. He reached for his heavy wool overcoat. "He expects me to remain here, waiting for the inevitable assault. He expects me to barricade the door and arm myself, but to act exactly as one's opponent anticipates is to guarantee one's own defeat. We are not going to wait for him, Watson. We are going to invite him to a place of our own choosing." "Where?" I asked, reaching for my hat. "The National Gallery," Holmes said, grabbing his walking stick. "It is late, the halls will be largely deserted, and the security staff is notoriously susceptible to the right sort of persuasion. It is the perfect venue for an intellectual confrontation, and, more importantly, it is where the original authentic Mediterranean naval contracts have been hidden all along." I froze. Hidden at the gallery? But how? "Lord Julian was a patron of the arts, Watson," Holmes explained as we hurried down the stairs. "His private correspondence, which I skimmed while you were busy checking the locks on the study door at Malvern House, revealed a passionate obsession with a specific 17th century seascape. He donated heavily to the restoration fund of the Dutch Master Gallery. The portfolio is not in an iron vault. It is tucked behind the frame of a canvas that has been slated for emergency cleaning for the past 3 weeks. Our journey to Trafalgar Square was made in a private hansom cab that Holmes had signaled from the street. The metropolis was drowning in a yellow sulphurous pea souper that turned the gaslights into sickly floating orbs of light. As we approached the massive neoclassical facade of the National Gallery, the building loomed out of the mist like the tomb of a forgotten god. Holmes paid the driver, and we approached the side entrance, a service door used by the cleaning staff. With a few subtle manipulations of his lockpicks, Holmes swung the heavy door open, admitting us into the vast echoing silence of the interior. The smell of oil paint, varnish, and centuries of dust greeted us, a scent that seemed to quiet the soul, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. We moved through the dark, cavernous halls, our footfalls swallowed by the expansive marble floors. Holmes navigated by the dim beam of his pocket lantern, his eyes scanning the gilded frames of the masterworks that lined the walls. Finally, we reached the Dutch and Flemish gallery. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing his stick toward a massive landscape painting depicting a stormy sea, its waves frozen in time by the artist's masterful brush. "The Tempest on the Scheldt. The portfolio is strapped to the rear of the frame." I moved toward the canvas, my hand trembling as I reached for the edge of the ornate gilded molding. But before I could touch it, a soft, deliberate footfall echoed from the far end of the gallery. "I wouldn't touch that, Doctor." "Watson," a voice purred, a voice that was cool, cultured, and devoid of any human warmth. I spun around, my revolver drawn, to see a man emerging from the shadows of a marble pillar. He was tall, dressed in an immaculate evening suit with a high silk cravat, his features obscured by the brim of a top hat. He moved with the predatory grace of a jungle cat, his gloved hands held out to his sides, showing that he held no weapon. "Sherlock Holmes," the stranger continued, stepping into the circle of dim light cast by the gallery's moonlight-filled skylights. "I have followed your career with great interest. The way you dismantled the Moriarty organization was, if I may say so, a work of art. But tonight you have overstepped your bounds. You have meddled in matters that belong to the boardrooms of empires, not the sitting rooms of suburban detectives. And you, I presume, are the man known as the Albatross," Holmes said, stepping forward until he stood between the stranger and the painting. His voice was calm, conversational, almost bored. "I am a man who appreciates efficiency," the stranger replied, a faint metallic glint appearing in his hand as he produced a small, silver-plated pistol. "And you, Mr. Holmes, are a glaring inefficiency. The blueprints, if you please. Hand them over, and perhaps you shall live to see the dawn, though I highly doubt you will care to remember it." "I am afraid that is impossible," Holmes replied, his hand moving with lightning speed. He didn't reach for his gun, nor did he strike at the albatross. Instead, he swung his walking stick sharply against the heavy bronze stanchion that held the velvet rope cordoning off the painting. The stanchion tipped, falling against the marble floor with a resounding, thunderous clang that echoed like a cannon shot through the vaulted gallery. The albatross recoiled, his finger tightening on the trigger of his pistol, but before he could fire, the shadows at the opposite end of the gallery erupted with movement. A dozen men in the dark uniforms of the Metropolitan Police, led by a furious-looking Lestrade, poured out from behind the heavy velvet curtains of the exhibition hall. "Drop your weapon," Lestrade shouted, his own pistol leveled at the stranger's chest. "You are under arrest, in the name of the Crown." The albatross froze, his icy composure fracturing for the first time. He looked from the police to Holmes, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, incandescent hatred. "A trap," the stranger whispered, his voice trembling with venom. "You sacrificed the naval schematics to Whitehall forgeries just to lure me here." "Not just to Whitehall," Holmes corrected, stepping calmly toward the man as the police closed the circle. "To the very place where the true documents were held. I knew you would not be satisfied with the forgeries once the Admiralty realized the error. I knew you would come here hoping to recover the original contracts Lord Julian hid before his death. I merely provided the coordinates." The albatross snarled, raising his silver pistol toward Holmes, but a shot rang out, not from the police but from the shadows of the doorway behind us. A bullet whistled past Holmes's ear, shattering the frame of the Tempest on the Scheldt, sending golden splinters showering down upon the marble. "Down, Holmes!" I screamed, tackling my friend to the floor just as a second shot splintered the wood of a nearby chair. The gallery dissolved into pandemonium. The police returned fire, the reports of their revolvers deafening in the enclosed space. Blue flashes of gunpowder flared in the darkness, illuminating the terrified faces of the statues that lined the walls. I fired my own weapon at the muzzle flash near the doorway, catching a glimpse of a second man, the brute from the station, his shattered wrist bandaged in white linen, who was desperately returning fire while dragging the albatross toward the exit. "They're escaping," I shouted, scrambling to my feet. "Let them," Holmes commanded, holding me back. "The police have the exits sealed. There is nowhere for them to run." As the smoke cleared, the firing ceased. The albatross, realizing he was utterly surrounded, dropped his silver pistol and raised his hands, his face a portrait of cold, aristocratic defeat. Lestrade's men surged forward, tackling the stranger to the floor and snapping the steel manacles onto his wrists. I walked over to the painting. The frame was ruined, but the canvas remained intact. I reached behind it, my fingers brushing against the cold, familiar texture of the canvas portfolio. I drew it out and held it up to the light. "The real contracts," I whispered, relief washing over me. Holmes walked over to join me, his coat torn by the fall, his face smeared with dust, but his eyes glowing with the fierce, quiet triumph of the hunter who has brought the quarry to ground. He reached out and placed a hand upon the portfolio, his expression for a fleeting moment softened by something resembling respect for the man who had died to keep it hidden. "Lord Julian was a fool, a gambler, and a traitor," Holmes said softly, looking toward the albatross, who was being dragged away into the darkness of the hall. "But in the end, he was a man who understood the value of a secret. He held the destiny of the British Navy in his hands, and he chose to go to his grave rather than let it fall into the hands of a man who would sell the world for a price." The great game was over. The Mediterranean naval contracts were safe, the blackmail ring had been shattered, and the most dangerous espionage broker in Europe was finally in chains. Yet, as we walked out into the cold, damp air of Trafalgar Square, leaving the gallery to the police and the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ripples of this single case would be felt in the corridors of Whitehall for years to come. Holmes walked beside me, his gait steady and calm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his empty clay pipe, and tapped it against the heel of his boot, his gaze fixed on the distant, fog-shrouded spires of the city. "The tragedy of this case, Watson," he murmured as we turned toward the waiting carriage, "is not that Lord Julian died. It is that men like the albatross exist, and that they will always find another secret to steal, another empire to exploit, and another soul to corrupt. The world is a dark, swirling sea of deception, and our work, I fear, is only just beginning." Chapter 10. The quietude of Baker Street. The London we returned to in the early hours of the following morning was a city transformed. The persistent sulphurous fog had been purged by the biting eastern gale, leaving the streets washed in a cold moonlight clarity that lent the architecture of the metropolis a ghostly, unreal beauty. As our hansom cab rattled toward Baker Street, the silence of the city felt different, less like the oppressive, laden quiet of a house harboring a secret, and more like the peaceful exhaustion of a landscape that had survived a great storm. I sat back in the worn leather upholstery, my limbs heavy with the weight of the last 48 hours. The events at the National Gallery, the flash of gunfire, the frantic chase through the marble halls, the capture of the man who had styled himself the master of European espionage, all felt like a fever dream, distant and receding. Yet the canvas portfolio resting at my feet served as a solid, undeniable testament to the gravity of our labor. It was no longer a threat, it was merely a package, soon to be returned to the Admiralty and buried beneath the bureaucratic indifference of Whitehall. Holmes sat opposite me, his tall, spare figure relaxed, his eyes closed. He was not asleep. I knew the rhythmic, shallow nature of his respiration too well for that. He was cataloguing, sorting, and filing away the details of the case, his mind already moving on to the next intellectual challenge. He looked remarkably composed for a man who had narrowly escaped a bullet less than 6 hours prior, his face an island of serenity in the turbulent wake of our adventure. When we finally reached the familiar 17 steps of 221B, the world seemed to have tilted back onto its proper axis. Mrs. Hudson had left a single gas lamp burning in the hall, and the air within our sitting room held that comforting, familiar scent of old tobacco, chemical reagents, and the faint, lingering aroma of the mutton tea she had prepared the night before. Holmes walked directly to the hearth and began to stir the dying embers of the coal fire with a pair of iron tongs. He did not ask for a report, nor did he offer a summary of our triumph. He simply set the fire to roaring once more, stripped off his heavy overcoat, and settled into the Persian sofa with the sigh of a man reclaiming his rightful domain. "It is a curious thing, Watson," Holmes said, his voice quiet as he reached for his long-stemmed clay pipe and began to pack it with the coarse black shag he favored. "How quickly the machinery of the state grinds such extraordinary events into the dust of administrative procedure. By this time tomorrow, the Albatross will be in a cell in Newgate, the blueprints will be back in the Admiralty safe, and the entire episode will be codified as a regrettable attempt at espionage by a minor foreign syndicate. The true magnitude of the danger, the vulnerability of the Suez, the corruption within the very offices of the Foreign Office, will be neatly redacted from the official record. Is that not for the best?" I asked, sinking into my armchair and feeling the exquisite pleasure of the springs yielding to my weight. "The stability of the government relies upon such redactions, I suppose." "Stability," Holmes repeated, striking a match and puffing until a blue cloud of smoke swirled around his lean head. "A wonderful word, is it not? It covers a multitude of sins, but it does nothing to prevent the next albatross from rising to take his place. Ambition, greed, and the thirst for power are not crimes that can be permanently incarcerated, Watson. They are the constants of the human condition. We have solved the mystery of the Black Ledger, yes, but we have only touched the surface of the web." I watched him through the haze of his pipe smoke, noting the lines of exhaustion that had finally begun to etch themselves around his eyes. "You seem remarkably grim for a man who has just averted a national catastrophe." "I am merely reflecting upon the nature of the game, my dear fellow," Holmes replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "When one stares into the abyss long enough, one begins to recognize the patterns in the darkness. Lord Julian was a weak man, corrupted by his own circumstances. The Albatross was a man of cold, singular purpose. They were but two players in a drama that has been running for centuries. We are simply the audience that occasionally takes the stage to rewrite the final act." He leaned forward, his eyes suddenly bright with a familiar, restless curiosity. "Do you remember the case of the Vatican cameos, Watson, or the singular incident of the aluminium crutch? In each instance, we believed we were striking a blow for order, for justice, and for the preservation of the truth. And yet, the world remains largely unchanged. The fog returns, the gas lights flicker, and the petty dramas of London continue unabated. But I should not want it any other way. Without the challenge, without the pursuit, life would be a stagnant pool. It is the friction of existence that provides the spark." I smiled, my fatigue beginning to lift as I listened to the familiar rhythm of his voice, the cadence of a mind that found its only solace in the ceaseless interrogation of reality. "And what of the future, Holmes?" I asked. "Does the quietude of this winter evening offer any respite from the grander game?" Holmes looked toward the window, where the first faint pale streaks of pre-dawn light were beginning to bleed into the sky, turning the cold blue to a soft bruised purple. The street below was beginning to stir. A milk cart rattled by, its horse's hooves ringing clear and sharp against the frost. "The future, Watson, is an unwritten page," Holmes said softly, "but I suspect it will be quite as demanding as the past. I received a note this morning, delivered by a man with the unmistakable gait of a courier from the Russian embassy. He did not leave a card, but he left an envelope that smells faintly of Turkish tobacco and sea salt. I have not yet opened it." My heart gave a faint leap of anticipation. "A new case?" "Perhaps," Holmes said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a square of cream-colored stationery. He held it up, turning it over in his long, slender fingers. "Or perhaps merely a warning. Either way, the respite is over. The curtain is rising on a new act." He tossed the envelope onto the mahogany table. It lay there, innocent and unassuming, yet I knew it to be the herald of a new storm. I looked at my friend, the man who lived in the narrow space between the light of logic and the shadow of human depravity, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. For all his arrogance, for all his social detachment, and for all his mercurial moods, he was the steady hand upon the tiller of my own life. Without him, the world was a chaotic, nonsensical jumble. With him, it was a puzzle that could always, eventually be solved. "Will you open it now?" I asked. Holmes paused, the stem of his pipe poised between his lips. He looked at the envelope, then at me, and finally at the dying fire in the hearth. He rose, walked over to the mantelpiece, and picked up a heavy silver letter opener. "Not just yet, Watson," he said, his eyes reflecting the soft morning light. "First, I believe we owe it to ourselves to finish that breakfast Mrs. Hudson has been preparing. I am told she has made kedgeree, and for all my faults, I have never been able to resist a well-seasoned fish dish." He walked toward the door, his movements fluid and lithe, his energy entirely restored by the simple prospect of the unknown. I stood and followed him, the weight of the last few days falling away as I realized that in the quietude of Baker Street, amidst the clutter of chemicals, books, and the constant murmur of the city, I had found my true home. The case of the secret hidden in the black ledger had reached its end. The secrets of the Admiralty were secure, and the villains were headed for the gallows. But as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a long golden ray across the rooftops of London, I knew that the silence would not last. The game was always afoot, and I, for one, was ready for whatever the next chapter might bring. "By the way, Watson," Holmes called out from the doorway, his voice light and airy, "pray remind me to procure a new Stradivarius. My current instrument suffered a most ignominious fate during our skirmish at the gallery, and I fear the D-string is quite ruined. One cannot be expected to conduct a proper investigation with a bridge that has been stepped upon by a dockyard thug." I chuckled, my spirit lightened as I stepped out into the hallway to join him. "I shall add it to the list, Holmes, right after the morning newspaper." And so the morning began. In the heart of the great indifferent metropolis, two men walked toward their breakfast, utterly unaware and entirely indifferent to the fact that they were the only thing standing between the civilized world and the encroaching chaos. It was, as it had always been, a perfectly ordinary day in 221B Baker Street,